a volunteer coordinator for the Back to the Base program. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about our program. I know many of you are members, which is great. We're a foundation that works within Cornell Cooperative Extension to help support all of our restoration and research initiatives, like the Seahorses that you're going to hear about tonight. All of the merchandise that you see up here, as well as our membership program, is just a way to get the public involved, both in terms of a contribution, but also, coming to our events, actually getting your hands dirty and helping us with some of our research and restoration. Tonight you're going to hear from Kim Manzo, who is our Seahorse expert, and she's also very, very involved with the Habitat program. So she's going to tell you all about how those two things coincide and how we help protect our base. So thanks for coming.
All right, thank you, Hazel. All right, yes, my name is Kim Manzo. I've been with Cornell Cooperative Extension Marine Program for 19 years now, mostly working under the Habitat program. So for most of that time, we've been doing a lot of eelgrass restoration, and it sort of fell into my lap that one time when we were going to monitor some eelgrass plantings, we found seahorses back in 2009, and ever since then I've been sort of obsessed with them. They're basically my hobby within work, and the more excuses that we can get out and learn more about seahorses, it just helps us understand not only the value of eelgrass, but just more about this really unique and unusual animal, and also what we can do to help conserve it. So I'll get started tonight. So I'll just start off with, what is a seahorse? So seahorses actually are true fish. A lot of people don't really necessarily realize that, but they are a fish. They have all of these really amazing traits that make them different than most fish, right? Most fish have scales. Seahorses don't. They have these bony plates under their skin. Yeah, and it's just like a thin layer of skin over those bony plates. So they're almost sort of prehistoric looking if you look at them up close. Of course, they have that curved head like a horse. That's why they get that name, right? They can actually change the color of their skin to blend in with their environment, much like a lot of fish can, such as flounder, and different animals like that. They have that long snout to suck in their food, right? So they're sort of limited on what they can eat. They don't have like teeth, and they don't have a jaw that can open and close. So everything they eat has to be able to fit through that long, slender snout. And of course, they have, eyes that move independently from one another, just like a chameleon would. So this all has to do with their hunting strategy, all of these traits that they have. And of course, that prehensile tail. So when I say prehensile, that means basically like a monkey. That tail is used as an additional limb. So that tail is used to hang on to the eelgrass, which is their favorite habitat. We'll get more into that. And what many of you might know, which is what seahorses are sort of famous for, is that the male actually becomes pregnant and gives birth to the babies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and why that would be, a strategy for reproduction. So some unique behaviors of seahorses. Highly cryptic, so I'll kind of get into that a little bit later, but they don't like to be seen and they're very hard to find in the wild. They are monogamous. So at least here in temperate waters where we live, we know they're at least seasonally monogamous. So once they find a mate, they stay together for the entire season. And they also have something called site fidelity. So once they find a mate, they stay in that location with their mate for the entire season, and potentially in subsequent years, which is what we're trying to sort of learn a little bit more about. So there are many different species of seahorses around the world. Right now there's about 46 recognized species, but there are a few that are still in the process of getting recognized. Many of the newest ones that are being discovered are these tiny little pygmy seahorses found in coral reefs and sponges, even down into deep waters where they're finding these deep sponge gardens and stuff. They're discovering these minute little seahorses that never leave that one sponge that they live on, which is pretty incredible. And blend in completely. It's amazing the camouflage abilities. But you could see, there's a lot of variation around the world. From the giant Pacific seahorse, and there's another really large species from Australia. There's several throughout Mediterranean and European waters. But really, many of them are the most populous, and there are the most different amount of species, more in the Indonesian area of the world, which is where we believe they sort of evolved from. So some relatives of the seahorses, part of the same family of fish known as the cygnathids, would be, of course, you might recognize like the leafy and the weedy sea dragons from New Zealand and Australia region of the world. There's also some incredible pipefish, which are part of that same family of fish. They all exhibit a bit of that male parental care, but not that full pregnancy. So you can kind of tell that this group of animals, seahorses have really taken it to the next level in terms of their efficiency with this pregnancy situation. So some local relatives of our seahorses would be our pipefish. We have some here in our tank today. Pipefish have a lot of the same traits. You look at their head, you can see that they have that same long snout. They also can change color to blend in with their environment. They have those bony plates just like seahorses. But the difference, of course, is that they just have that long, slender body. I'm going to get into why we believe that seahorses basically evolved from a fish like a pipefish. So you look at the anatomy of a seahorse, and you notice that it's almost like the seahorse is a fish that's sort of standing up. Their dorsal fin is actually here, when most fish, that would be on the top of their back. But of course, that's on their, they're more of in a vertical position. So they actually swim using mostly their dorsal and then their little pectoral fins. When most fish would mostly swim with their caudal fin, right? That tail fin is the main way they propel themselves. So because of this, seahorses are not the fastest of swimmers, and they don't intend to be necessarily. They like to hang on to their habitat and not wash away. So they're not really looking to be really great swimmers. All right, so I like to talk about sort of this evolution of seahorses because, when you go down, through the fossil record, we see that around 25 million years ago is when grasses, like terrestrial grasses, started to migrate into our waters and become what are now known as seagrasses. And around this time is when we notice that we have some sort of primitive pipefish-like fish that eventually, after a few million years, start to evolve into some of this more upright vertical structure. And we've actually even found out recently that there are sort of these missing link animals that are known as pipe horses. So they're kind of a halfway species between the two. So you can see that some of them are sort of more pipefish-like, but they're starting to have a little bit of that horse-shaped head, right? But these are starting to look a lot more like seahorses, but they still sort of swim more of in a horizontal fashion, right? So they're sort of that missing link. So actually I should mention, so the reason that seahorses eventually became fully upright, really it has to do with their feeding strategy. So over time, it actually became more efficient for them to be able to hang on and really hone in on their predators. So I like to picture a chameleon, right? When chameleons are sneaking up on their prey, they move very slowly, right, and get as close as they can, and they hone in visually with their eyes. And at the moment they believe is the best moment is when they strike, right? So by seahorses being able to hang on and sort of sneak up on their predators, they're actually a lot more efficient than pipefish at successfully capturing their prey. So I think this evolution has to do with them just having a more successful feeding strategy over all these millions of years. Right? So our species locally is known as the northern line seahorse. Some special features of it would be, of course, like its name, it has these white lines along its face and body, and even these dots along its tail, and many of them even have this saddle-like pattern on their back. But the thing is these seahorses can change color, right? So sometimes, it can be hard to distinguish the same exact individual based on what sort of default color they're in that day, But the cool thing is, we're starting to use some more image analysis to try to identify individual species that potentially would be captured on different occasions. So we'll get into that a little bit more. Yeah, so this coronet here too on the top of their head, this spiky part on the top of their head, is basically where their jaw has become fused together. And the way that they feed is just by sort of snapping that jaw internally in their body, and it creates a suction that they can suck their food in. But another cool thing is that that coronet is a unique characteristic among each individual. So we can identify a seahorse based on its coronet. It's almost like a fingerprint. Another thing is their stripes and lines can also be, are also very unique, much like a zebra. So you can identify them that way as well. So this is all stuff that we're trying to get into in terms of trying to prove site fidelity, which I'll talk about a bit more. Oh yeah, I didn't mention. So around here, I mean, the maximum height of northern line seahorse is about 7.5 inches. Really, that's pretty large, and that would be with the tail fully extended. Usually, they're more like 4 to 5 inches long. And this is all examples of the northern line seahorse. So as you can see, they can look very different depending on the environment they're living in and how they're trying to blend in. So not only can they grow what we call here cirri, which are basically almost like skin that can grow off the top of each one of their spines to help them camouflage. So it's almost like hair, but it's really just extra skin that grows off. So if they're living in some eelgrass or in a seaweed habitat that has a lot of like branchy, things coming off of it, that would really help them to camouflage themselves. But a lot of them are found in areas where there's also sponges, so they would take on a much brighter color to blend in with that. And even ones that sort of live in maybe like an encrusted, this almost looks like coral and algae. If any of you have been down to Florida and you've seen something like that. So this seahorse probably lived in some environment like that. So they can even create like these bumps and lesions on their skin to help them blend in. So really they're incredible at camouflaging themselves. And then of course, the seahorse anatomy. How can you tell the difference between a male and a female seahorse? Really, it's quite simple. The male has this big brood pouch, right? And during the summer months, it's usually really obvious because if they're breeding, that brood pouch is very much expanded and, blown up, such as in this picture here. But even when they're not pregnant, you can identify them because, as you can see, the female doesn't have that soft skin that covers over the brood pouch, and the brood pouch actually extends halfway down the tail of the male. And you can see on the female, at the base of the abdomen, it's almost like a right angle, and she continues to have bony plates throughout her whole lower abdomen and tail. So here's some photos of a male and female, so you can kind of see the difference here. Pretty easy to identify that nice inflated brood pouch versus the female with the bony lower abdomen here. So habitat and status. So like I mentioned earlier, 20 or so million years ago, these animals evolved to live in seagrass, right? And that's why they evolved to have this really unique and upright structure. And unfortunately, we're losing a lot of our seagrass now. So these animals that have lived for millions and millions of years in this certain habitat are now sort of trying to adapt to new environments and find different habitats to live in the absence of eelgrass. Of course, in other parts of the world, they can be found not only in seagrass, but there's even more highly specialized seahorses that are now affiliated with coral reefs, even specific corals, like I mentioned, like those little pygmy ones. Even in sargassum, if you guys have heard of the Sargasso Sea, many young seahorses end up out in the Sargasso Sea rafting on sargassum as well, so that can be a really good habitat for them. And even just like our mangroves and sponge gardens and things like that are places where they're found around the world. So every single species of seahorse found around the world is at least listed as being vulnerable on the endangered species list. So that's about 3 tiers down from endangered. The reason for that is because of habitat loss and also just lacking data on all these species. So they just know that they're naturally rare, they're very habitat dependent, and when they know that that habitat is disappearing, so it's pretty much assumed that most of them are they're losing their numbers and their populations are dwindling. So our species, the lined seahorse, is listed as vulnerable. But there are other species that are even in worse shape than the lined seahorse. And so around the world, the main threats to our seahorses would be traditional Chinese medicine. They're still collected, and it's almost like a black market around the world for dried seahorses. They're considered to have a lot of qualities as a medicine, but it hasn't really fully been proven that any of those things truly work. But unfortunately, it's still very much practiced around the world, so they're collected for that reason. Of course, the aquarium industry, aquariums love to have seahorses. It's one of the most important things to showcase. They get a lot of attention. Fortunately, in the United States, most of our aquariums have a good practice of sharing animals and not collecting from the wild if they don't have to now. So we have a lot of captive breeding programs in our aquariums. So that's one good thing. Over the course, the past 10, 15 years or so, I've really noticed that very few people are really collecting from the wild for this purpose anymore, at least around this region. And then other problems around the world would be this non-specific bottom trawling that still happens in a lot of areas. And that trawling, of course, pulls up seahorses and all kinds of other species as well. And a lot of them would be considered sort of like junk fish and things like that. But seahorses actually get such a high market value that when they trawl for them, they're one of the most valuable things that come up in these bottom trawls. Yeah, there's just an example of some dried seahorses at a market in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is estimated that about like 60% of our black market of dried seahorses for traditional Chinese medicine is coming out of Hong Kong. Okay, and I think I mentioned that. And most of the other species around the world are, like I said, at least listed as vulnerable. If not, they're even further classified into either endangered, threatened, or endangered. All right, so before I mentioned cryptic versus camouflage, of course they're amazing at camouflaging, right? They could change the color of their skin, they can even make these appendages on their bodies. But not only can they do that, well, first I'll show you here in this picture. There's actually two seahorses. I'm not sure if you could see them both. The first one is kind of obvious. The second one is kind of pointing his head towards the back here, so you could just sort of see his tail, and then the very top of its head, he's facing away. So that's sort of one of the strategies of seahorses. When we approach a seahorse, the first thing they do is move really slowly and turn their back to you like this, and they almost vanish. All their movements are very calculated and slow. And if you can't see that profile, they pretty much disappear, So that would be an example of like something of their cryptic nature, right? They're trying not to be found. So not only do they do things like that, they make very slow movements, they even sway with the grass, and if they mistakenly get rafted away in some grass, they just kind of float with it and pretend that like they're a part of that eelgrass or whatever they're rafting with until they can make a quick getaway. So they really don't like to be vulnerable and out in the open. They love to have something to hang on to and hide in. So this is a video of what it's like to find a seahorse in the wild. Sorry, I don't want to block you guys too much. You'll see my hand kind of come scoop it up. The only reason I had seen her make a quick getaway, so I grabbed the camera. Oh, so there it is. So, they're not easy to see when you're diving, and they don't want to be captured, so it's not very easy to get a great photo of them and things like that diving. So we do still try to do that and go diving and looking for them, but honestly, one of the better ways of finding them is by seining for them. So we'll get into that a little bit later as well. So I talked about how seahorses are monogamous. So part of that daily ritual is that the male and female, once they're bonded as a pair, they actually sort of greet each other every morning with they wrap their tails around each other. They even sort of swim around each other. It's called promenading. They circle each other. They kind of display different colors, and then they go about their day. So we sort of think, oh, how cute, that's almost sort of romantic or something like that. But really, if you're looking at it from a scientific perspective, this is part of them trying to become perfectly synced in terms of their reproductive schedules, right? So this way, they're keeping very much track of when that next brood is going to be born, and so that the female can have eggs ready to be immediately deposited back into that brood pouch so they can just keep the broods of babies going. So they're sharing that reproductive sort of energy, that responsibility, by sort of splitting that cost, that energy cost that it takes. A video of a male pregnancy. So they truly do, give birth. They have contractions. He starts twitching a little bit. You'll see a couple start to escape from the pouch. So this is just more contractions, and then next thing you know, you're going to see them all start shooting up to the surface. There he goes, so he's pushing them out now. And there they are. So they're just these tiny little miniature versions of the adults. Little tiny seahorses. They shoot straight up to the water column. And in nature, they would be free swimming up in the water column for at least a week, maybe 2 weeks, feeding mostly on plankton before they settle down to start wrapping and finding that holdfast, or that something to hang on to, like eelgrass. They're pregnant for about 3 to 4 weeks, and depending on the size of the male seahorse, he can have from 100 to 400 babies, would be what the lined seahorse can have, depending on their size and everything else. And like I mentioned before, this is all about sharing that energetic cost, right, of pregnancy. Another theory as well is this certainty of paternity. Maybe this whole monogamy thing has to do with that, because if any of you know a lot about, fish, even like tropicals, there's a lot of sort of sneaky males that come in and impregnate a female throughout the fish, world. So this could be a strategy to sort of prevent that and ensure that that male is the only male, because they're so synced up reproductively that another male could not possibly be able to take on those eggs at that exact moment, So here's a newborn tank. So when they're born, they're only about a centimeter long or so. But they can change color from day one, so they just look like a big bowl of all yellow and brown and sort of natural colors, but they're constantly changing color even on day one. And the first thing they like to feed on would be our most common zooplankton, right? So that would be our copepods. So they pretty much are one of the most important food sources for all of our fish larvae out in the ocean. So same goes for seahorses. So they're one of the smaller crustaceans, and that's pretty much what they like to eat, are different crustaceans. So as they get older, they'll feed on these like larger species called amphipods, which are kind of like small shrimps. Kind of like what I like to think of them as almost like the insects of the marine world. So seahorses are almost like, like some type of an insect eater, like an ant eater or something like that. They're highly specialized to feed on these. And this is something that would be commonly found throughout an eelgrass meadow, right? These are animals that feed on the grass itself. So maybe at some point throughout our history, seahorses had a really important part in keeping that herbivory down, right? If these amphipods exploded in population, they would be mowing down our grasses. So I think the seahorses were, helping to keep that population at bay. And then as they get older, they start to feed on some larger crustaceans like grass shrimps, and even these are ones we find very commonly down in the South Shore Bay. They're known as Zostra shrimp, or we call them broken back shrimp, because they literally have a right angle for a back, so that's one of their names. But Zostra, like their name says, is actually the same genus as eelgrass, Zostra marina, so they're very much affiliated with eelgrass itself. I have a cute little video of some juveniles feeding. So these were 6-week-olds, and I happened to find some shrimp larvae, so it was kind of like the next best food in terms of size, a little bit larger than copepods, but smaller than some of those bigger amphipods. And if you look closely, you can kind of see how their eyes move independently and how they kind of sneak up and hone in and suck their prey in. And I mentioned earlier about how that suction occurs, like it has to do with their coronet, that fused jaw, right? And they can create, they can basically snap that jaw, it creates that suction. But that little noise that they make is actually a way that researchers can actually estimate populations of seahorses. I went to college down in Tampa, and I worked with someone who was studying populations of seahorses in Tampa Bay through acoustics, of listening to that feeding sound, all those popping sounds of the seahorses feeding. Yeah. So now we get into the Seahorse Conservation Initiative. So this kind of was just like I said, it sort of fell into my lap. I'm already in eelgrass restoration. You know, they're almost the perfect ambassador for the work that we do, right? Like very few people know about eelgrass, yet everyone knows what a seahorse is, right? So we launched this initiative. We wanted to start learning more about their populations in our bays. We had only seen them, here and there, and gotten a few reportings, brought to us of other people that were finding them, mostly in the Peconic Bay area. And so when we were able to start programming down in Hampton Bays at our Tiana Bayside facility, we are within walking distance out to an eelgrass meadow. So we thought, what a perfect way to just get the public involved in just coming and trying to monitor and capture seahorses. So what we do is we take groups of people out, and even our camp groups as well throughout the summer, and we pull seine nets through the water. And you can even see here, they're not like a normal seine. We make these rigid seines out of basically PVC and mesh. And we even use these sort of zip ties along the bottom to act as a comb, because that actually helps to sort of comb through the grass and loosen the seahorses up, because they like to hang on and really towards the base of the eelgrass usually. So we really have to make sure we're all the way at the bottom and we're combing through the grass. And then we scoop the seines up. And when we find a seahorse, we take our measurements and make sure we get a really great photo, that has the size. Some type of a size reference in it so that we can go back and estimate, the torso length. I won't go too much more into that. And so the whole idea is that we want to get an idea of their populations, how many males are out there, females are out there. I mentioned site fidelity, so if we can find that same seahorse again in the future, that shows that that seahorse is most likely has a mate and is not going to move that area at least for the entire breeding season, unless it somehow gets disturbed, right? But we've been also kind of venturing throughout Shinnecock Bay a lot this year to sort of explore other locations. And we've also been planting eelgrass down in this area since 2018 through different funding sources. So this is, of course, helps the seahorses as well, that we're building up that habitat in this area. All right. So I'm just going to introduce Anna now. She's a graduate student from Stony Brook, and she came on board with me this past year to sort of help get this initiative going and really make it more scientific, right? We need to really be collecting more data, trying to analyze these seahorses and sort of map out what we're finding so we really can get an idea of, visually where there are hot spots for these seahorses, so that hopefully there's potential for us to report this to the people who manage our waterways, right? Like, for instance, Shinnecock Bay is managed by the town of Southampton. It's not, it's not state waters, it's town waters. So they very much can and have been great working with us and giving us sanctuary areas to plant eelgrass. And if we can report back to them about, there are areas that are absolute, hot spots for seahorses, they should really be protected, right? Because they're so rare everywhere else that if we can find locations that they're prevalent, we really should be doing as much as we can to protect those areas. So a little bit of what Anna's going for here with her research is she's helping to sort of map out these multiple sightings that we've been having. So our most successful site this year has been at the old Ponquag Bridge site. So, the park that's right, at the south of the Ponquag Bridge there, where the old fishing pier is. There's nice eelgrass along that whole beach area, just east of the bridge. And this area, of course, is known as a great place to go scuba diving. Scuba divers from the entire region come here just because the congregation of animals under that old bridge and just the biodiversity is incredible in this spot. So that doesn't, it makes sense that it might also be a good spot for our seahorses. If you know anything about Shinnecock Bay, as our water comes in, it really has to rush and pinch through sort of that small area under the bridge, right? So as that flooding tide comes in, it's bringing in a lot of cool ocean water, which is really good, especially with climate change and everything else going on, right? And it's also bringing in all those fish larvae from the Gulf Stream that are coming up. So we even get a lot of tropical fish in this area, and even throughout the whole South Shore, but this spot here, there's something with the hydrodynamics that it just deposits a lot of really incredible species. So this map here shows what we have found throughout the summer. We've gone seining 3 times at this location, and we found a total, what's the total? Total of 13 seahorses over those 3 visits to Ponquag this summer. And some of those were actually found very close to each other, and some of them even could potentially be a repeat capture. So the next thing we're getting into is what you can see over here. So this is known as an image J analysis. So this is like a software you can use that can compare. So not only can you do your measurements, and so the thing is with seahorses, to get their length can sometimes be tricky depending on that picture and how they're holding their head and things like that. So we can use this software to really get accurate measurements, but also to really look closely at those unique characteristics and try to figure out if it's the exact same individual we caught last time. So this is all stuff that we're working on right now and hoping that we find a few that were repeats. I'm sure at least a couple of them were, because they were found in such close proximity where they were in the previous time we were there. And so yeah, and other things we would love to expand on with this initiative. Of course, planting more eelgrass. We're constantly getting different funding sources to plant eelgrass because that's the most important thing. You know, without their habitat, seahorses are really sort of struggling to find other habitats that are suitable for them and their lifestyles and their behaviors. Something that I'm really interested in is creating sort of artificial reefs known as seahorse hotels that could be using sort of old maybe lobster pots or other fish pots that are really sort of derelict and not good for fishing anymore, that could be sort of gutted out and create a nice artificial reef that would not only benefit seahorses, but of course all of our young marine life would love to congregate in something like that. So this was actually something that was done successfully down in Australia years ago after they had a really bad, I guess it was a cyclone that hit the west coast, no, I believe it was the east coast of Australia. And they had there's a species of seahorses in this area that it has a very small home range, right? And when all the sponges got knocked out during a storm, all the seahorses disappeared. So what they decided to do was sort of start putting some of these like old fish pots out, and sure enough, after a couple of years, the seahorses started coming back, right? So as long as those are going out and permanently being put out as artificial reef, right, then the seahorses can continue to have that same life strategy, right, of having their bonded pair, and once they form that mated pair, they don't want to leave they have a very small home range, right? And they don't want to be disturbed from that. So, the more that we can do to create this permanent habitat, and in places where we can't grow eelgrass because the water quality conditions just aren't good enough for it anymore, this would be a good alternative, right? We're finding a lot more people are reporting sightings of seahorses on their aquaculture gear, which is wonderful. So they're sort of using these cages that are on the bottom, for growing oysters or whatever shellfish they're growing. And really, it's a great habitat for them, at least temporarily, because they can find tons of food because those cages get fouled up with all those different organisms and even those amphipods they love to eat. The issue is that they're usually removed several times throughout the season, so a bonded pair, that's not really going to make the ideal habitat for them. They're going to end up scattering from that area and looking for another place to go because they want more of a permanent place. And we are, like I said, we're sort of wondering, this is a temperate species, right? So just like all temperate fish, seahorses sort of migrate in the winter offshore. And nobody really knows exactly how far off they go. You know, we know a lot more about commercially valuable fish, you know, where they migrate to in the winter. But seahorses just sort of disappear into deeper water. We're not sure how far. Maybe they're just going into the deepest water of the bay, or maybe they're going all the way out into the ocean. All I know is the DEC trawls, they pick them up in 100 feet of water or more sometimes, trawling. So they're capable of migrating pretty far, which is really pretty amazing considering they're not the best of swimmers. And the question is, if they are going out that far into the ocean, are they coming back into the bay to those same exact locations? You know, there's a lot of marine animals that have that site fidelity, you know, like sea turtles that somehow know to come back to the exact beach they were born at, right? You know, look at, you know, penguins or, I don't know, I can't even name, there's so many different marine animals that they have that site fidelity. You know, they want to lay their eggs where they were born. And it's sort of just instinct, right? And that's the question. Do seahorses have that same instinct to come back to that same location? So we do a lot, you know, within our Back to the Bays program to sort of teach people about seahorses. We have a lot of like youth initiatives. So of course we incorporate seahorse, you know, art and other like little scientific experiments and projects in our summer camps. We usually, you can find us at the horse show, what is it, the Hampton Classic every year, because we have the Seahorse table at the horse show, you know, we try to tie the two together, and we even had sponsored one of the riders a few years ago, and he did really well. So anyway, the part of it is just like getting the word out there about them, you know what I mean? Just getting pictures out there, getting the word out, just getting the word out about eelgrass and how important it is. And of course, kids love seahorses too, so that always helps. During COVID, we got into these sort of little education kits. So we even have a seahorse kit you could purchase on our digital education website. So it's almost like a little camp in a box, and it has all these activities for kids to do about seahorses. And then we even do like adult education classes. We have paint and sip events that are very often themed with seahorses. And even what we're now starting to do these artsy, so not only painting, but also more just like crafty types of adult courses that you can sign up for to create different seahorse art. And of course, we sneak in a little education before the art class starts. All right, so I found a seahorse. How do I report it? Okay, so ideally, we don't want it out of the water for very long, right? I always tell the kids that I'm working with, when you're pulling a fish out of the water, they're holding their breath, right? So only keep it out of the water as long as you would be able to hold your breath, right? So we want to take it out of the water quickly, try to get a good picture of it. And we want, the number one thing is we want you to put it exactly where you found it. Put it right back in the water once you get that picture, because its mate might be waiting for it right below, right? And we don't want to separate that bond. Otherwise, they might, you know, that's the end of them breeding for the rest of the season and potentially forever, or at least for that entire breeding season. So that's potentially thousands of young seahorses that are never going to be born and, you know, have the ability to eventually become adults. Of course, if you could jot down where it was taken, definitely the date is all important stuff. Location is really, really key, because we really want to start mapping out, like I said, and figuring out where these hot spots are so we can help to relay that information to our local governments. And even people often find them washed up on the beach. You know, it's pretty common to find a dried one up on the beach, but I still like those reportings as well. You know, it tells us that there are seahorses in the vicinity, right? And we can tell if it's a male or female about how old it was, even if it's dead. So I love getting any type of reporting. Right now, I'm mostly just having people email me. I have my card here too, if anyone wants to take it with them. So let's say you're a diver or somebody is out on the water a lot. You're a fisherman, you're a bayman, you're an aquaculturist, and you want to help. The best thing to do would be, like I said, to just continue to just take those great pictures and take really good notes. And just put them back in the water. And then hopefully you'll find it again and again if it's coming off of your gear, right? Wouldn't that be cool? Of course, I love when students come to me asking to like get involved in the initiative. One of the big things is just awareness campaigns, right? You know, You know, teenagers nowadays are so great on social media. They can create these awesome TikToks and, you know, these reels and stuff, and in a fun way really get that information out. So I'm always looking for that sort of age group to help out, just to spread awareness. And even students can sort of take it on as like their own little individual projects. A few years, so last year and the summer before, I had some interns that in their own time, they would just go out seining in different areas, and they would report back to me what they found. So that could be something that can be done on your own time, you know. And of course, we also have Seahorse, like, public seining workshops. So this past summer, we had 2 public workshops. Unfortunately, yesterday was one of them, so that was the final one of this year. But definitely stay tuned if you're interested and you want to get out on the water. We'll be posting more of those for next summer for sure. Right, but how else can you help seahorses? Of course, you know, I'm an eelgrass person, so the #1 thing would be we need to plant more eelgrass, right? So we need to protect eelgrass. We need to be responsible boaters. If we live on the water, we don't want to be dumping, you know, our lawn fertilizers and everything else into our bays. Let's be responsible, try to keep our water quality good, because eelgrass needs clear, cool water to grow. So the more that we could do to keep our water, you know, that way, the better, of course. You know, spread the word about a little bit of what you learned today would be great. And then we have what's called Marine Meadows workshops in the fall. So this is when people can come get involved in actually restoring eelgrass. They can actually help us above water, right? So, you know what, I'll get into that in a minute because I believe I have a couple slides about it. So definitely stay tuned. These usually occur on the weekends in October, sometimes during the week as well. We're going to be having them throughout our, like, this area, the whole South Shore, honestly, because we just got a 5-year grant to bring back eelgrass throughout the entire South Shore estuary. So we're going to be sort of spread out along much of the South Shore in the next 5 years, hosting these workshops. Another thing you could do is become a Back to the Bays member. We have some sign-up forms here. This $25 membership just helps to get all of our restoration programs going and just helps support the work that we're trying to do today. We even have some merchandise up here you could purchase, and we even collaborated with a jewelry maker who made these awesome necklaces here. She provided us with a few. They were casted from an actual dried seahorse that I provided for her. So they're a fun gift, and they give us 10% of their proceeds to the initiative, which is really cool. So here's Marine Meadows. So in the fall months, if you guys would like to get involved in helping to restore eelgrass, this is basically one of our newest methods of planting eelgrass. We call it our tortilla method, just because we sort of feel like this looks like a tortilla. The fancy word is the burlap disc planting method. But so in these burlap discs, we are able to weave 10 shoots of eelgrass, and then these are planted underwater. So you can see here, each diver would go down with between 50 and 100 of these tortillas that each have 10 shoots on them. So it makes us much more efficient in terms of planting underwater rather than planting individual shoots. And this is how we plant. After many different variations to this method, we have figured out that we don't need to anchor these in any way. That's always the issue is eelgrass, you plant it and it just needs to be anchored at least for a few weeks, because you could have a storm come the next day and it's all just going to wash out, right? So you just need to have some way of anchoring it long enough that its roots can start to hold. Then the anchors don't really matter anymore, okay? So we found that just by pushing this, it's basically just a ring of PVC, like a big cookie cutter, I like to call it. We push it down into the sand, and we use, I don't know where my clam is, but we actually use clam shells as shovels because they work great, big surf clam shells. We scoop the sand out and sort of level it out. So as you can see, we're bringing that level of sand down a couple of inches, and then we're popping in the loaded tortilla of eelgrass and then replacing that sand on top and just pulling this off, right? So then you're just left with these rings of grass, and we just do that over and over in rows and rows. And this is at restoration sites that we have already vetted. We spend a lot of time looking into the conditions at that site before we even attempt to plant eelgrass there. So it takes a lot of, a lot of homework. We have to make sure the temperature is going to be okay for the entire season. The water quality is not going to, be too terrible through the summer months, that it's not going to be able to survive, things like that. And of course, it depends on our funding sources. So, it's usually within the body of water that we're getting funded to do the work. And then there's the whole off season. So we actually have workshops throughout the year, mostly with kids. I would say 8 and older is the ideal age group, but we actually can make these burlap discs here just by cutting burlap. We have these nifty little presses that were made by a workshop. Actually, this was, I believe it was Hampton Bay's shop class about 10 years ago. Came up with our little prototype here. And we love them. All it is like simple, plywood, little plastic pipette tips that we can get millions of for practically nothing. We have them kicking around at work. And we just crank out hundreds and hundreds of these discs so that in the fall, when we're ready to have our Marine Meadows workshops, we have plenty of these discs readily available. So you can see we've gotten involved with many different groups. We did a lot of work down at the Shinnecock Nation, working there with eelgrass restoration, and lots of different school groups and scout groups and things like that, as well as in our summer camps too. So I mentioned before, we have the relationship with Man-Made Jewelry. They're helping us spread the word about seahorses. In each of their little packaged seahorse necklaces, they have little information cards and ways to sort of get involved in our program. Yeah, and that's about it. So I'd love to answer any questions you guys have, if I didn't answer them already for you. In this tank here, we have a display of some pipefish I should have mentioned earlier. I sort of talked about how pipefish are really almost like similar to what the ancestor of most of our seahorses would be, right? So they have sort of a lot of those similar traits. And when we find a lot of pipefish, we know that habitat can likely support seahorses as well. They eat the same prey, right? They like that same eelgrass. So it's just a good indicator that there should be seahorses present when we see a lot of pipefish, but not necessarily. They seem to be a bit more hardy. Yeah, they don't have that same monogamous lifestyle like the seahorses do, which I think can be, it could be detrimental to them in some ways. It makes them vulnerable, for their habitat being lost since they have such site fidelity, and the pipefish don't have that same thing. Yeah. That's about it. Any questions? Yeah.
So you said that there's some other species that are big. How big do they get?
So not in our area. This is our only species here, but yeah, I know that there's a giant Pacific species that's, I believe, like 18 inches tall or something. That's if you elongated its tail, but so it's a huge seahorse, Yeah.
What is the major cause of eelgrass? Is it the toxic algae?
No, so there's been a lot of things that have been a problem with eelgrass over the years. I would say the timeline is like in the 1930s, there was a disease, actually, a wasting disease that killed a lot of it. Not only on our coast, but also throughout Europe. So it's kind of a little hard to explain, but the little protist-like animal that sort of naturally lives within the grass that would help it to naturally biodegrade when it dies somehow became virulent and started killing healthy grass at that time. So we don't know what triggered that. It could have been some type of chemical put into the water maybe, but for it to be happening on such a wide range, we really don't know. So that happened in the 30s. We lost a lot, and then some of it started to recover. Then I would say the brown tide of the 80s was the next, sort of epidemic for eelgrass. We lost almost all of our eelgrass in the Peconics, and we lost a lot of it down in our South Shore bays as well, unless it was really close to the inlet, that it could be flushed really well. Brown tide makes the water look like chocolate milk. Like, light can't penetrate, so nothing can grow, So the eelgrass dies first, and then all the creatures that would live in the eelgrass would suffer after. I mean, if any of you are bay scallop fans, bay scallops and eelgrass have a special relationship in that, young bay scallops like to attach up high. They have those little byssal threads like mussels do, and they can attach up high onto things because they're really vulnerable to getting eaten by crabs and stuff like that. So In the 80s, when we lost our eelgrass, the scallop population, the bay scallops also, plunged. So we're still sort of recovering from that now. And there's also just the things like, even in between that, I would say maybe in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of coastal development happening as well. We were dredging out a lot of our creeks, which would be the deepest areas of our creeks, so that we could make channels for our boats, and that was the areas that the eelgrass could grow, So we eliminated a lot of all the places that it could grow and was growing, because we didn't know how important it was at that time necessarily. And it was still prevalent in a lot of areas, so a lot of people just thought it was just this nuisance grass. It was clogging up my intake, and it was just in the way. Let's rip it out so I don't have to deal with it anymore. They didn't realize it was a great habitat for the fish they were probably going out to fish for, So it's just like combining all these things together. Now we know so much more about how important it is. And, I focused on seahorses tonight, but I can talk about eelgrass all day too, and about all the different, commercially valuable fish that are found in our eelgrass meadows, that, it's considered a nursery ground for almost every fish that you would find in our fish market. So as juveniles, they're hiding in there, and they're able to survive and get to that adult phase a lot easier than if they were roaming in an unvegetated, desert-like sandy area where they could just get snatched up and eaten by a predator, right? So I think there was a study done on winter flounder, and it was found that winter flounder juveniles grew 10 times faster in an eelgrass meadow than in unvegetated nearby meadows, or nearby sandy bottoms. So not only are they able to hide in there and escape predators, but they're just finding so much more to eat at the same time, so their growth rates are higher. So this would be, I would imagine, the same for all of the other, juvenile fish in there. So, yes?
Thanks for your talk. I learned so much. I know this is more of a practical information session, but I'm really interested in the seahorse pigmentation. Could you tell us about our Lyme seahorses? Do they only have melanin as their pigmentation? And then also, could you say anything about the sort of stress response and pigment? And if our seahorses also have a kind of emotional pigmentation response?
Yes, so yeah, I'm not an expert on the actual pigmentation type, but it's 100% an emotional response, or at least a behavioral response with them. As well as, I'm sure, having to do with their, being cryptic and wanting to hide. But when you capture one, they change color in front of your eyes. A lot of times they go white. It's like their emotional response. So, and even when they're having that mating, that bonding ritual they have every morning, they're changing their colors like crazy, which I feel like is also almost an emotional response, right? So, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of mysterious that they can do it so rapidly like that, right? Yet literally it happened before our eyes, and some of our pictures that we were seeing this yesterday and even last week, we captured one, and then just within a few seconds of taking pictures, it had gone completely like white on us. Like it was brown, white, brown, like the whole thing looks like a totally different seahorse within seconds, So, yeah, it's really just amazing. So I don't know what else to say about that. I wish I knew a little bit more about exactly which pigments were happening and how that was happening, but not really my area of expertise. Yeah.
Do they have any natural predators?
Yeah, so I don't think that there's any predators that are specifically seeking seahorses, but they've been found in the guts of striped bass or other bluefish, other larger, more predatory fish. But I think that's more of just they happened to find that seahorse. It was an easy thing to eat, and then they went on their way. I would say one of their main predators are actually diving birds, like cormorants. So at low tide, or even any diving bird that can hover and see it from really high up and dive down. There's been probably the most sightings of that in terms of predation with diving birds than any other animal. Yeah.
So what are the benefits of a seahorse? What do they do?
That's a good question. So I feel like now in today's world with such little eelgrass, I don't know that they're necessarily, super important for the entire ecology of the meadow. But like I said earlier, I believe at some point during our, our history, when those seagrasses were rapidly expanding and all of those little, herbivorous animals were in there, I think that they very much were helping with the population control of those herbivores, So I'm sure that helps today as well. It's just I feel like eelgrass has so much more going against it than just the herbivory at this point, you know what I mean? So, for me, we like to just call them, they're important just because they are an indicator species of a healthy eelgrass meadow, right? They wouldn't be living there otherwise. So, and like I said, they're sort of an ambassador for just eelgrass in general. Yeah. And they're like our mascot. I don't know. Yeah.
Do you know if there's any DNA libraries being established, or is it specifically for the South with their migratory, possibly with the most?
Yeah, so the species we have here is actually found all the way from Nova Scotia down into South America, believe it or not. There are other ones that are specifically tropic, so there is that overlap of that range. But yeah, a lot of our seahorses, I believe that those, young, 1 to 2 week old young that are still sort of plankton, right, in the water column for a little while before they settle down, they get caught in that Gulf Stream, and that's why they're so prevalent in all our South Shore bays, because all that water just comes rushing into our bays, and if they happen to land in an eelgrass meadow, that's where they're going to stay, So I feel like we get a lot of those young. It's just a matter of, if there's no habitat for them, they just are likely just going to get eaten. They're so vulnerable. But yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of it is that they're coming from south, but it's not like with other species that we're seeing with climate change. We're seeing northern migration of things because they were already found south of us. If anything, they might be migrating further north into Canada. I'd be curious to learn about that for sure. All right. Anyone else? Yeah.
Is there any thought towards the conservation efforts, maybe developing like a farming system for them? I know in Kona, Hawaii, they have a very successful farming system, and they release them back into the natural habitat.
Yes.
Is that something that you think?
Yeah, so this is something that I was really interested in a few years ago. In Hawaii, I'm not sure the species that they're breeding and releasing, if it's more specific to the seagrasses or to the coral reefs there. So the problem is that I spoke to someone who's very much like world-renowned in seahorse conservation, and I told her about that. We were successfully breeding them in captivity like crazy, and we wanted to maybe explore like more of a mariculture setting. Because the issue is you can't raise an animal in an aquarium and then release it to the wild, because there's a lot of potential for transferring diseases and other things to wild populations, right? So if you can raise them more in mariculture, so basically in like fish pens or something like that, out in the water, then you don't have to worry about the disease being introduced, right? So this expert had told me that, yes, that could be great, and you might successfully release a lot of seahorses, but what is the problem in your region right now that you don't have seahorses? And I said, well, they don't have habitat, right? So we can release millions of seahorses if we want, but if they don't have habitat to live in, it's not really going to do us any good, So really, planting more eelgrass, protecting the eelgrass we have, is probably the #1 thing we could do to help seahorses here on Long Island at this point. Yeah.
Do any seahorse tracking any place besides around Shinnecock?
Yeah, I'm interested in all over Long Island. I have people emailing me from all over. We even had a sighting in Pier 5 in Brooklyn. They were doing a small eelgrass planting there and had a GoPro, just filming for a few hours underwater, and sure enough, a little seahorse comes through the video. It's like amazing. So yeah, we find them in Long Island Sound. Whenever we're going out to check on our plantings of eelgrass, we're always sort of looking around for them. We found them on Plum Island, throughout Peconic Bay. More so now, I would say, recently, the Peconic Bay sightings are more on aquaculture gear than on our eelgrass, believe it or not. I think it's just because it's just becoming... Yeah, there's just so much gear out there. I think it's just available for them, you know. And it can, like I said, serve as good habitat, at least while they're young and they're still sort of transient before they, find a mate. So.
What's the perfect habitat for eelgrass?
Good question. So that's the thing. Eelgrass is pretty finicky. Really, it's a northern species, and we're almost at its southern limit now. It used to survive down into like the Carolinas, and now down that far, and even in the Chesapeake area, it's becoming more of an annual. It dies off for the whole summer, and it relies on seed to come back. And their populations are really dwindling as it gets too hot for eelgrass down there. So for us, the ideal habitat, it can grow in different sort of substrates. Usually pure sand is ideal. But of course, you don't want like pure sand that has ripples in it like you would see like at the ocean. You have to look for all these signs of how much disturbance that area is getting. So a lot of times when we dive and we're checking out a site, we sample the sediment because we don't want it. We like a lot of sand. We don't want a lot of mud that's anoxic that makes it that much harder for the grass to establish into. But we've also planted in rocks. Up in Long Island Sound. We have a rock planting method of planting eelgrass. And the cool thing is, we literally just stick a couple shoots under some rocks because that's just the natural substrate of the area. But over time, as it expands and becomes more dense, it actually traps sand and it completely transforms the bottom. And it's known as sort of an ecosystem engineer in that it acts like a snow fence, right? So as that grass is vertical in the water column, it's catching all that drifting sand and other turbid sediments that are up in the water, and they're able to really trap it and keep it in their root systems and even utilize it, if it's organic nutrients for growing. So a lot of times where there's eelgrass, the water is more clear. Sometimes you come into like a harbor or even a creek if it still has eelgrass in it, and it'll be kind of murky from turbidity of boats or something, and then all of a sudden you look at the eelgrass and the water's crystal clear because it's helping all those sediments sort of settle out of the water column. We do a lot of, like I said, testing of areas before we plant it there. We monitor for temperature because one of the main things is we don't want it to be like we say 25 degrees Celsius, which is like mid to upper 70s. It becomes stressful for grass. Like really, it's like I said, it's a cold water species. 55 to 65 Fahrenheit is like the optimal range for growth. So anything over 65, it's having a little bit of a stress response. It's not growing as well, Right,
so it's really too warm.
It's too warm. At least during the summer, eelgrass is just in like stress mode. It's in it's like almost dormant. But once it cools down in the fall, to that optimal range, that's when we usually plant it because it has the longest amount of time that it stays nice and cool until that following heat of summer. So it can establish those roots underground and really get that energy base that it needs so that it can survive those tough months of the next summer, We sometimes plant in the spring as well, but we've had a lot more success planting in the fall because of that reason. It just has that much more time to establish. If any of you are gardeners, one thing I like to mention is eelgrass is a perennial, right? There's this old saying about perennials, first year sleep, second year creep, third year leap. So they take a long time to establish and grow. We really don't see like major expansion for a few years, really. It takes a long time for them to really, get all that below ground biomass, and then they could start expanding out, but they put a lot of energy into getting their root systems going. Anyway, great questions. Anyone else? All right, thank you guys for coming tonight.